Now, you'd imagine that someone who championed gay and women's rights when they were either illegal or unfashionable might have a place in history, but most people haven't even heard of Edward Carpenter, who lived near here, on the edge of the Peak District. Lucy Hester's been to find out more about this Victorian rebel.
Edward Carpenter was decades, not centuries, ahead of his time. He led a very unconventional life, a life that he decided to make his own.
If we're to understand the future, we have to understand where we came from, and Carpenter explains it. And that's why I don't think Carpenter will ever be forgotten.
He would run around naked in the garden, and some of the neighbours would overlook him and wonder what was going on, I think.
Over 120 years ago, here on the rural fringes of Sheffield, Edward Carpenter lived as an openly gay man. He led a simple, eco-friendly life, all the while formulating radical politics for the masses.
He was a Victorian rebel and a sandal-wearing pen pal of Mahatma Gandhi, amongst others, and his home was a bohemian commune from where he spread his vision of a world he wanted to live in.
I have sometimes been accused of taking to a rather plain and bohemian kind of life, of associating with manual workers, of speaking at street corners, of growing fruit, making sandals, writing verses or whatnot, as at a great cost. But I can safely say that in any such case I have done the thing primarily and simply because of the joy I had in doing it, and to please myself. If the world or any part of it should in consequence insist on being reformed, that is not my fault.
As unlikely as it might seem, he had started out work as a curate, who then turned down the chance to become a tutor to the future king. Leaving the church, he then turned his back on his privileged southern upbringing and headed north.
It had come to me with great force that I would go and throw in my lot with the mass, people and the manual workers.
He lived in Leeds and Chesterfield before settling in Sheffield. This letter from Carpenter to the Sheffield Independent complained of the smog the city's industry churned out. But the air in the village of Millthorpe, just 10 miles from the grime and smoke of the city, was much more to his liking. He was to spend the next 40 years there. Writer and broadcaster Roni Robinson's passion for the life and work of Edward Carpenter has lasted for half a century. We took a visit to the pub where Carpenter played the piano.
Anyway, we'll see if we can get a drink from the landlord. My mum was a little kid, probably when she was 12, 13, came out to Millthorpe, to Carpenter's place, with her dad, who was a member of the ILP, the Independent Labour Party, and they came out in what my mum described as a wagonette. I don't really know what a wagonette is, but they came with a load of other ILPers, lefty people from Sheffield, trade unionists, to come out and stay at Carpenter's for the afternoon, and they had tea while they were here, and my mum met him.
The fragments of his life are carefully catalogued and stored as part of a remarkable archive here in Sheffield. His letters, essays and books attest to his influence over many decades. This letter from Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald confides in Carpenter about the burden of office. Gandhi asks if a friend can stay at Millthorpe.
Carpenter was a hoarder and he kept everything, books, papers, even these sandals that he made and wore as part of his simple, eco-friendly life.
Whilst living at Millthorpe, he wrote many of the 40 books he had published. One of his most celebrated works on the subject of sexuality was Homogenic Love. He believed that same-sex relationships had the power to subvert the rigid class system. He lived at Millthorpe with George Merrill, a labourer from Sheffield. Their relationship is widely believed to have influenced D.H. Lawrence when writing Lady Chatterley's Lover.
Eros is a great leveller. Perhaps the true democracy rests more firmly than anywhere else on a sentiment which easily passes the bounds of class and caste and unites in the closest affection. The most estranged ranks of society of good position and breeding are drawn to rougher types, as of manual workers.
Back in the late 1800s, it's hard to overstate how shocking Carpenter's relationship with Merrill would have seemed. They lived here as a couple.
Perhaps it was the seclusion of his life here at Millthorpe that saved him from the moral outrage of the Victorian era, not to mention the law.
This was the time when Oscar Wilde was jailed for his sexuality.
During his own lifetime, homosexuality was still punishable by life imprisonment, yet he lived an open life with George Merrill, his lover and partner. That was a very brave, courageous thing to do. Not many other people in Britain, anywhere in Britain, did that. And we owe a great debt and tribute to Carpenter for having the courage to come out at a very, very difficult time when society was much more intolerant.
Sheffield University stages a season of gay icon lectures. Tonight's speaker is Peter Tatchell.
I fear that many people at tonight's meeting may not be aware of Edward Carpenter. They may not realise his significance, the pioneering ideas that he articulated over 100 years ago. My gay icons. Firstly, Edward Carpenter, the great 19th century utopian socialist. Edward Carpenter is undoubtedly one of the inspirations and influences upon my life, a very important one. Not only do I get inspiration from his ideas and political activism, but also just from the way he lived his life. The fact that he didn't uncritically conform to the way things are.
His political writing included the concept of a minimum wage. He lectured widely across the north to spread his ideas. Former Chesterfield MP Tony Benn sees Carpenter as part of the history of the Labour Party.
The ideas that he spoke about and encouraged and wrote about and argued for are still a part of the present. Because every generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again. And looking back on Carpenter and the battles he fought and the things he believed in can be seen to have a very great relevance today when you look at the totally different world in which we live.
Back at Millthorpe, Carpenter attracted the famous and influential of the era. George Bernard Shaw, Siegfried Sassoon, George Orwell and polar explorer Captain Oates were amongst those who passed through his door. And more than 80 years after his death, his influence is still apparent. This house has been run as a bed and breakfast because of the number of visitors wanting to come here.
This is the visitors' book from Carpenter House, and it's amazing because there are people here from Australia, Italy, USA, New Zealand, all here from all over the world, and just because of one man and his legacy.
When Jo McGee moved into Carpenter House nearly 60 years ago as a child, her family was unaware of its history.
Well, of course, at the beginning, we didn't realise there was anything famous about Edward Carpenter, but as the years grew on, we got an awful lot of visitors, and we began to realise that he was a person of note. We had a lady who wrote a book about Carpenter, and she came to stay a lot. So I got all her research notes, and I found out a lot more about him.
And this is one of Carpenter's least known legacies. England Arise doesn't sound out of place in church. It may seem like a hymn, but it is, in fact, an anthem to socialism.